The average pastor at a mid-sized church can earn the equivalent of $3,800 a month between tithes, offerings, and ministry stipends. But at megachurches, that figure multiplies more than 15 times over, and almost no one outside the inner circle knows exactly where that money ends up. Across the United States alone, there are more than 350,000 churches and religious congregations currently registered, a number larger than every Starbucks, McDonald's, and Walmart location combined operating in the country. According to estimates from religious research groups, the entire sector takes in somewhere between $80 and $100 billion a year in tithes, offerings, and donations, not counting the value of land, buildings, and property accumulated over decades. That money is not spread evenly. There's an enormous gap between a small neighborhood church held together by a handful of families and a megachurch with multiple campuses, its own television network, and a live stream reaching hundreds of thousands of viewers every Sunday. And that gap is exactly what most people never stop to calculate. Over the past 2 decades, the number of independent and non-denominational churches in the country has grown dramatically, driven mainly by the opening of small and mid-sized congregations in suburban and rapidly growing areas. But that growth in numbers does not translate into equal growth in revenue. A small group of large churches concentrates a disproportionate share of all the money moving through the sector, while thousands of small congregations split a much smaller slice of the total pie among themselves. A small church typically gathers between 50 and 200 regular members, almost always in a rented space or a modest building, held together by families from the same neighborhood. A mid-sized church already operates on a different scale, with somewhere between 500 and 2,000 members, its own building, a fixed staff, and a steady rhythm of services, events, and internal departments. And a large church, the kind that fills arenas and stadiums, easily surpasses 10,000 active members, with campuses in multiple cities, and a structure that looks a lot more like a corporate franchise than a traditional religious community. To put that scale into perspective, a single megachurch can reach more viewers through live stream in one weekend than most regional TV stations reach in an entire week, without spending a fraction of what a broadcaster spends on production. Understanding this scale is the first step toward answering the question that actually matters: what it costs to enter this market, what it takes to sustain it over time, and what separates a congregation that barely covers its bills from one that becomes a financial operation of national scale, with a brand, a media arm, and a real estate portfolio to match. Starting a church from scratch does not, in theory, require a large upfront investment, and that is exactly why the sector grows so fast. Anyone with charisma and a small network of contacts can rent a hall, buy a basic sound system and a microphone, and start gathering a dozen families on Sunday afternoons. The startup cost of a small congregation usually lands somewhere between $15,000 and $40,000, covering the first months of rent, basic audio equipment, folding chairs, printed materials, and the legal paperwork to register as a non-profit religious organization. A process that can take anywhere from 3 to 6 months to fully clear. But keeping that structure running month after month is where most of these projects fail before reaching their first anniversary. Without a steady stream of new visitors, early offerings rarely cover even the rent on the hall. When a congregation grows and decides to build or buy its own building, the investment jumps into a completely different category. A well-located piece of land, construction costs, a professional sound system, screens, streaming equipment, furniture, and parking can easily add up to somewhere between $1 and $5 million, depending on the city and the size being planned. On top of that come construction permits, traffic impact studies, zoning approvals, and fire and liability insurance. Paperwork that often takes months to clear and that few founders budget for in advance. Hiring permanent staff is another jump few anticipate. Musicians, sound technicians, cleaning staff, security, bookkeeping, and assistant pastoral staff add up to a monthly payroll that, at a mid-sized church, can easily exceed $40,000. And there is still the working capital needed to cover the first months of operation, when offerings are not yet enough to cover fixed costs, let alone pay the pastor a proper salary. Many growing congregations also end up hiring outside legal and accounting help to stay compliant with local tax rules, an expense rarely mentioned from the pulpit, but one that can quietly run into several $1,000s a month once tax filings and payroll compliance are factored in. Most congregations that shut their doors within the first 3 years do not fail for lack of faith, but for lack of basic financial planning, and for underestimating how much it really costs to sustain a structure that grows faster than its income allows, especially once a building lease and a full-time staff are already locked in. Once up and running, money flows into a church through several different doors, and understanding each one is key to understanding where a pastor's income actually comes from. Tithing, the voluntary giving of 1/10 of a member's income, remains the main source of revenue for most congregations, followed by weekly offerings, which typically add another 20 to 30% on top of the total collected. On top of that comes special offerings for specific projects, like building a new hall or funding a mission trip, which at large churches can raise more in a single weekend than a small congregation collects in several months. Megachurches add extra revenue streams that multiply their income even further. Book sales and merchandise tied to the pastor's brand, paid conferences and leadership courses, church-branded apparel, streaming revenue, and international donations from members who follow services online from other countries. Some large churches even charge monthly subscriptions for exclusive access to digital content, a revenue stream that barely existed a decade ago. On the expense side, maintaining the building, electricity, water, and climate control for large spaces eats up a steady share of the budget, along with payroll for fixed staff, which at large congregations can account for more than a third of everything collected. Audio and video production, increasingly professional in order to compete for attention on social media, has become one of the fastest growing hidden costs. Cameras, editing, community management, and paid advertising to attract new visitors, property insurance, maintenance of institutional vehicles, and ministry travel for the lead pastor round out an expense list that rarely becomes public. And there's a cost almost no one mentions: seasonality. December and year-end giving campaigns push offerings noticeably higher, while the first months of the year, right after the holidays, tend to bring a steady drop in collections that forces many churches to cut spending or delay projects. That constant back and forth is, for many pastors, more stressful than running any traditional business. On top of that comes a cost that rarely shows up on any official balance sheet: member turnover. Every year, part of the congregation moves away, switches churches, or simply stops attending, and keeping offerings steady requires constantly attracting new families, an effort that eats up time, advertising money, and pastoral energy that is almost never counted as a real cost of doing business, even though it directly shapes how much ends up in the offering plate every single week. With all that money moving in and out every single week, we still have not reached the number that matters most: how much the pastor actually keeps after every expense is paid, and why that figure varies so much from one church to the next. If this investigation into how a church's finances really work is opening your eyes, hit that like button right now. It helps us keep uncovering how money actually moves behind institutions that almost never talk about numbers. After covering rent or building upkeep, payroll, production costs, and operating expenses, what is left for the pastor of a small church usually lands somewhere between $1,500 and $3,000 a month, a figure that in many cases is not even paid as a formal salary, but as a mix of a housing allowance and benefits covered directly by the congregation. At a mid-sized church with a more stable payroll and a larger volume of offerings, the lead pastor's income typically lands between $5,000 and $12,000 a month, a figure already close to what a bank branch manager earns in many parts of the country. But at megachurches, where growth multiplies through streaming, international conferences, and multiple campuses, some estimates from researchers who study the sector put the lead pastor's total income, including bonuses, book royalties, and speaking fees, well above $100,000 a month, a figure that almost never becomes public through any official channel. The difference between these three scenarios does not depend only on the size of the congregation, but on the legal structure of the church itself. Religious organizations in the country enjoy significant tax exemptions, which sharply reduces operating costs compared to a traditional business of similar size. But it also means a large share of this money moves with very little outside oversight. The real risk here is not just the lack of transparency. It depends almost entirely on the congregation's trust, and a single credibility crisis, a financial scandal, or the departure of a large group of members can cut income in half within a matter of months, with none of the safety net, severance package, or diversified client base that a conventional business would have to fall back on. In some cases, leadership of a megachurch passes from parent to child like a family business, and that succession includes not just the pulpit, but also control over real estate, trademarks, and streaming contracts that keep generating income for generations, something no member of the congregation ever sees reflected in any public document. It is worth it for someone with a solid community, real administrative discipline, and genuine leadership ability. For someone chasing easy money without that foundation, most congregations never make it past the first few years, and the pastor ends up earning less than in a traditional salaried job, after putting in far longer hours than almost any conventional position would require, weekends and holidays included. Behind every church, big or small, there is a financial operation with revenue, fixed costs, payroll, and risks that look a lot more like a business than a simple community of faith. Most people see a pastor as someone who lives purely off other people's generosity, without realizing he manages budgets, keeps a staff running, and faces the same financial instability as any entrepreneur. The real difference between a pastor who barely survives and one who builds a solid operation has nothing to do with the faith he preaches and everything to do with the discipline he applies to every dollar that comes through the door. The same discipline any other business would require. Anyone who understands this side of the job will never look at a church the same way again, and will never see a pastor as purely a spiritual figure, but also as someone who carries, week after week, payroll, fixed costs, and financial decisions as real as those of any established company. And that shift changes the way you hear every single request for an offering from the pulpit, no matter how small or how large the church behind it turns out to be. Do you think churches should be legally required to make their finances fully public? Or do you believe that money belongs only to the congregation that gives it in the first place?